I'd like to take a moment to share with you an interesting conversation that I had with a set of new clients. It's my hope that what I shared with them is a help to you the way it was to them. The original client is a 33-year-old mom. She's divorced with an 11-year-old daughter. She was married at the age of 22. And we had one session together where she had indicated some challenges with her mother. And she said to me, "Doc, I would love to do a follow-up session to discuss some issues related to my mom and how it's impacting my life. And I'm going to talk to her about doing that session." Well, she did talk to her mom, and her mom agreed to speak with me. Her mom is 50 years old. She only has one child, which is the daughter, and she had her daughter at the age of 17. On this call, my original client came to me and said, "Doc, I'm coming to you. We had a previous conversation, but I'm coming to you again with mom, who has agreed to talk because she's out of control and her behavior is starting to impact both me as well as my child." I said, "What do you mean? What's going on?" She said, "Well, first of all, she hangs out at locations where I hang out." And she said, "Doc, I'm not a clubber. I don't go to clubs and hang out at places like that. I may go to some lounges that are a little bit more laid back, more upscale, and I'll see her come into those places when I'm there, or either go there and see her there. And cool, if that's her choice, if that's what she decides to do, that's fine. She's grown. I can't tell her what to do, and she's my mom." She said, "But the fact that we're in the same places just weirds me out." I looked at her mom and I said, "Ma'am, do you find that to be weird at all?" She said, "Well, not really." She said, "I'm only 50 years old and I like to go out and hang out and have a good time as well. And we're in a small town. It's not really a lot of different choices. And I happen to go to a few places where my daughter goes as well, and I don't see anything wrong with it." The daughter then interrupted and said, "Doc, that would all be fine, well and dandy if my mom was just there with maybe people her age and maybe doing things that people her age do." I said, "What do you mean by that?" She said, "In terms of just being mature and acting like a mama, and more than that, acting like a grandma." She said, "But my mom, I'll walk in and my mom is up and she's twerking when they're doing songs, and she's in the middle of the floor and she's doing all this crazy stuff. And my friends are like, 'Girl, get your mama.'" And I laughed. I tried to keep a straight face. To know me in this space, my clients know I'm very direct, but I'm gonna laugh. If something's funny, I'm just gonna do it. And she started to laugh, and the grandma was just looking kind of serious. She said, "But it doesn't make sense for my mom to be up twerking and carrying on and doing all this stuff and acting like she's not a grandma." The mom looked at her and said, "What does acting like a grandma mean?" And the client, her daughter, said, "Well, Mom, it means looking like you have a daughter and a grandma." And she said, "I might not have all the answers. I just know that one day when I become a grandma, I don't imagine being in a place where I'm hanging out at clubs and lounges with my daughter. It's just weird to me." I said, "Man, what else do you have a problem with?" She said, "Well, second, I shouldn't have to be called to pick her up." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, sometimes she has called me late at night on more than 3 or 4 occasions because she's been hanging out. She got too drunk to make it home. She didn't want to call an Uber, so she calls me. And here I am as the daughter picking up my drunk mom from clubs and lounges and sometimes from friends' houses to get her home. And I find that very inappropriate." I looked at the mom and I said, Do you have a response to that?" She said, "It has happened a few times, but this is my daughter, and I would rather just ride with someone that I trust versus getting in a stranger's car at 2 or 3 in the morning when I've had a few drinks." I said, "I get all of that, ma'am." I said, "But the larger point is, do you see anything wrong with the fact that you have to call your daughter because you're out and having such a great time that you can't take care of yourself?" She said, I took care of my daughter until she was 18, 19. I don't see anything wrong with her taking care of me." I said, "Ma'am," talking to the young client, the daughter, I said, "Do you have any other concerns?" She said, "Well, third, I called her asking my daughter to borrow some money." I said, "How old is your daughter again?" She said, "She's 11. She's 11, and my daughter is very smart, and she occasionally sells things. She makes hand jewelry, beads. She has a little Etsy store She's a very brilliant young girl. She's even sold drinks, lemonade stands in our neighborhood. She said when her father and her were together, that they really taught her the importance of entrepreneurship and trying to establish her own money. And so she would take allowances and save up and build these innovative things to have her own money. And my daughter told me that her grandma called her one day and asked her for $20. I said, ma'am, talking to the grandma, is this true? She said, I did. I said, why did you ask your granddaughter for $20? She said, I happened to be out and I realized that I didn't have my wallet for something and I was a couple of dollars short. And so I called my granddaughter and asked her if I could just stop by and grab $20. I happened to be maybe 2 or 3 minutes from where they live. If I could borrow $20 so I could get to the store and get what I needed to get. I looked at the daughter and said, is this true? She said, that's what she says. I said, what did your daughter say? She said, my daughter said, in essence, the same thing. But she said that her daughter also said it was just kind of weird. I said, why did the daughter say that? She said, because that's grandma. She said, the daughter said, your grandma, like, why are you asking me for $20? I looked at the grandmother and said, ma'am, you don't see anything wrong with that either. She said, Doc, was just in a crunch. Like, I needed the money to just go complete a purchase. I left the stuff at the store. I ran out to get it and I came back and I said I would pay her back. I said, did you pay her back? She said, I did. I said, how long did it take you to pay her back? The daughter interrupted and said it took her about 45, 60 days to pay her back. And the only reason that she did is because I kept asking her to give my daughter her $20 back. I said, ma'am, is this true? She said, it is. She said, I didn't forget about it, but I mean, it's just $20. I said, ma'am, it's $20 that you didn't have. I said, so is this true? She said, it is. I said, okay. I said, I don't think this is very hard. I said, number one, ma'am, respectfully, grandmas and grandpas don't qualify for hot girl and hot boy summers. You don't qualify for that. And I don't care if you're just 50 and she's a nice looking woman to be 50. I said, I don't care what your attractiveness says. I don't care what your physique says. I don't care what your mentality says. I said, ma'am, you're a grandma. And grandmas and grandpas don't qualify for hot girl or hot boy summers. So that's number one. She said, well, then, Doc, if that's the case, then what should I be focusing on? I said, I'm glad you asked. I said, I'm going to give you 3 things you ought to focus on. I said, number one, you need to focus on your stability. I said, ma'am, you have no business borrowing money from your kids or your grandkids. And I know people can run into hard times. She said to me that she works. She has a couple of jobs that she works, but apparently she's living by herself. She only has bills for herself. She doesn't have to take care of anybody but herself. And I said, ma'am, you have no excuse to have multiple jobs and then to be asking your kids for money. I said, ma'am, there is a verse that I love that says a grandparent leaves an inheritance for their children's children. You know what that means? She said, I have an idea. I said, I'll tell you what it means. I said, your job as a grandparent is to not only make sure that your kids are doing well to the best of your ability, but to make sure you leave something for your grandkids. I said, ma'am, you ain't leaving nothing for grandkids that you are busy asking money for. And if you don't think there's something wrong with asking money from your 11-year-old granddaughter, there's something seriously wrong with you. I said, ma'am, the first thing you ought to be working on is your stability. And I don't care if you have to work 15 jobs. You have no business not being a stable example to your daughter and to your granddaughter, which leads me to number 2. I said, the second thing you ought to be working on is your example. I said, ma'am, your behavior is either going to make you the example or it's going to make you an example. Do you know what I mean by that? She said, I don't. I said, let me put it simply. How you carry yourself matters. You have no business being in clubs, clubbing with your daughter, in lounges, lounging with your daughter. You have no business. I said that I could see differently if you guys were on vacation, you're on a cruise ship, you're on some island, and you're on a resort club or something, and you guys are dancing and just having fun. I said, that's different. I said, but ma'am, if you're at the local weekend spot every weekend and your daughter has to look up and see you twerking with 20-year-olds, something's wrong with that. I said, at that point, you're not the example. You're an example. You're an example of what not to be. You're an example of how not to carry yourself. You're an example of what a grandmother should not be. You're an example of what a mother should not be. And I said, I get it. You are at a place where apparently you feel like you can just live and live your life. Fine, but live your life somewhere else. because this is not acceptable. I said, and that leads me to thing number 3. The third thing you can be trying to figure out is your purpose. I said, because at the end of the day, you have to figure out what's missing in your life and be honest about why it's missing, and then create something to be a substitute for what is missing. I said, ma'am, you had your daughter at 17. Your daughter got married at the age of 22. I looked at the daughter at this point in the conversation. I said, tell your mom what you said to me about why you got married so young. The daughter started to tear up at this point. She said, Doc, I got married that young because I felt like getting married to my then husband would create some stability in my life. My mom and dad were already separated, and that was an opportunity for me to get out of an unstable home with my mom and to get with a man that I thought would create stability. The problem was he wasn't ready to be the husband that he needed to be. And I recognized that, and I did the right thing and left. I said, ma'am, your daughter ran into the hands of another man. I'm going to translate this. She ran into the hands of another man because there was no stability in her home. And what you have to understand is you have to be honest about your role in this. I get it. You had her at 17. Maybe you didn't get to live a lot of your life the way you wanted to. I said, but ma'am, that is the result of having a child young. And people play and dance around with this. I know this won't be a popular take, but at the end of the day, when you become a mama, everything else is secondary. From you living your life and having fun to you looking for opportunities to twerk in lounges with 20 and 30-year-olds. I said, man, you need to figure out what your purpose is. And you need to be honest about that. And you need to fill those voids in a healthy way. Lounging, twerking, drinking are not healthy ways. I said, maybe you're not satisfied with your career. I said, you have no other responsibilities. Save your money, start a business. Look at your granddaughter's example. Figure out a way to find and make a better life for yourself. But by all means, it is not fair to sabotage your daughter and beg from your granddaughter because you're not pleased with your life. I said, man, you better figure out your purpose. And you better figure it out fast, because apparently there are some voids that are missing in your life that you are attempting to fill, but you're filling them in an unhealthy way. But your decisions are now having an impact on people who have nothing to do with those decisions. I said, ma'am, you're a grandma. Act like one. You're a mama. Act like one. Because at the end of the day, it is your stability, it is your example, and it is your purpose that's going to cause you to be the kind of mother and grandmother that they need. I said, and this does not mean you have to be a hermit. This does not mean you cannot live a good life. But I promise you, if you get stable, if you learn to be an example, and if you figure out your purpose, you can still live a great life, but still carry yourself in a way where your living does not impact them in a negative way. I said, ma'am, does that make sense at all? She was a little silent. I said, that's fine. I know this is a hard message to hear, and nobody's talked to you this way. I said, but ma'am, in my world, it is self-awareness that brings us to change. It is honesty about who we are, where we are, and what we're doing that creates change. I said, and ma'am, you ain't being honest with yourself, but I need you to be. And I'm pleased to say that after this conversation, she sent me an email and she set up 3 sessions for us to work together, to work through some things. And we've got an upcoming session, and I feel confident that she's going to do the work to become a better woman and a better example for her daughter as well as her granddaughter. I hope this story made sense. If it did, type church in the comments with 3 R's. And then remember, you've got 2 jobs. 1, be better today than what you were yesterday. And 2, don't forget what I told you. What's up, everybody? This is Dr. Zeb. Listen, I've been dying to make this announcement for a very long time now, and I'm pleased to say that Inspire Nation has officially launched. Yes, we finally got a Facebook and YouTube community group where we're going to have exclusive content, exclusive shorts, exclusive discussion prompts, where we're going to engage with other people literally around the world who are on the same healing journey that we're on. I need you to go find these pages right now on Facebook and YouTube. Inspire Nation, follow the page, join the group, introduce yourself, and be prepared to link up with literally thousands of people around the world who are on the same healing journey, who are looking for the same resources, and who want to also be surrounded with other like-minded individuals who are growing in the same direction as you are. I'm so excited about this because it's the beginning of some great things I can't talk about right now. Listen, you got 2 jobs. 1, be better today than what you were yesterday. And 2, don't forget what I told you.